Welcome back to the Pride Teach Out. My name is Roman Christians, and I go by they, them, theirs pronouns.
And my name is Mark Jungwon Fan, and I go by he, him, and his pronouns.
Over the past couple of weeks, we have been gathering the questions from participants, and this is an opportunity for us to discuss them in dialogue.
Great. So, Roman, one of our participants, Laura, asked about what the gay pride movement has looked like in comparison to the women's equality movement. Historically, according to Laura, the women's equality movement has focused most on white, middle-class women. And I was just wondering, in terms of policies that the women's equality movement has been addressing, how has pride been looking like in terms of their progress as well?
I definitely see that there are parallels between the women's equality movement and the LGBTQ rights movement, in that both have had a tendency to focus on issues that affect those who are maybe more represented, maybe those who have access with rights, with class, etc. So I definitely see that there's parallels. And I think the LGBTQ rights movement has struggled with the same questions. How do we push towards a movement, and how do we obtain rights that impact and affect all members of our community? But also, how do we make sure that we're centering those within our community that are multiply marginalized? When we think about issues along lines of race, issues along lines of socioeconomic status, when we think about gender identity and expression, there are often those within the community who aren't always represented in the movement towards equal rights. An example that comes to mind is the ways in which a few years ago in the United States in particular, there was a movement to legalize same-sex marriage. And there were actually critiques from within the community saying, yes, same-sex marriage is a right we all want, but it's not going to necessarily guarantee that I have employment. It's not going to guarantee that I can undergo avenues to affirm my gender. It's not going to guarantee that I will have economic stability. Same-sex marriage may only affect parts of the community. And so I think there's certainly that parallel between the different rights movement and how do we create that balance, how do we build and work towards rights that especially give access to those who are disproportionately impacted by marginalization and by oppression within institutions, within structures, within nation states.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And you alluded to same-sex marriage being, legalized in the United States a few years ago. And Laura's question focused a lot about policy issues. Right now, most recently, a few cases have been brought to the Supreme Court in the United States, which really brings us to kind of like an ultimate decision around LGBTQ employment. And I think that, we don't always think of different types of challenges that LGBTQ communities might be going through, because we tend to be celebrating same-sex marriage, right? When it is not the end-all be-all of what equal rights look like for the LGBTQ community as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I also think about how, don't ask, don't tell was a policy within the U.S. military that required those whose sexuality or gender identity differed from the norm to have to hide themselves, to have to conceal themselves. And that was repealed a few years ago, and yet now what we're seeing is a resurgence of movement to disallow and exclude trans people from the military. And so what happens when you try to address issues and rights within the LGBTQ community from a single issue focus, what may happen is that there are other ways in which policy is created or there is pushback against those movements to separate out the community or to, I would say, target, maybe even prey on the most vulnerable or the most marginalized within the community. And so that's something that I wanted to bring up because I think it can be a failing or a missed opportunity when we're working towards rights to not think about the whole picture. How is getting access within the military, how can that be granted to all people within the LGBTQ community, but also recognizing how and the ways in which the U.S. military might have a disproportionate impact on LGBTQ communities across the world.
Thank you. Yeah.
The second question we have is from Matthew Hurley. Matthew says, I'm familiar with Pride celebrations in the US and Europe, and I'm wondering how Pride is celebrated in other parts of the world. I know in many places there's still persecution, so celebrations wouldn't be as open, but even beyond that, are there cultural differences in Pride in different parts of the world?
Yes, this is a really good question. I think that, there are cultural differences in any topics, right? Whether it's pride, whether it's the way you live out your life as a trans person, as a gay person, as a lesbian person, right? All those are very different. I think within the U.S. context, we have some limitations in terms of terms that we use to describe people within the LGBT community. We have some limitations in terms of how we perceive certain subpopulations within the LGBT community. So, for example, in Mexico, right, like there's this mushes, is the term that they use to describe, what we would describe as a group of trans women who, really embrace cultural norms within Mexico. So all those are very different, right? I think in terms of Pride celebration, obviously, right, depending on the culture and the context and the environment, they differ from country to country. One of the things that I do want to highlight most recently, though, is, in Uganda, a few years ago, they had the first ever Pride parade for the country, which was really phenomenal, really celebratory, was really good. But recently, I saw that in a few weeks ago in the news that the government is wanting to bring back the laws that allow people to be killed based on their gender and sexuality of being part of the LGBTQ community. So I think that oftentimes we see rollbacks, we see progresses in different ways in different parts of the countries, sometimes both of them simultaneously. So in Brazil, for example, it's one of the most accepting South American country for LGBT people, but yet again, it's the country that has the most trans women murders, throughout the year. So it can also be an oxymoron, I would say, within the same context and same environment as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that while Pride as an event is always manifests itself as a celebration across the world, the visibility of that celebration and the ability for it to be out in the public differs a lot country to country, and that is often based on whether or not those countries and nation states have protections or don't have protections for gender and sexual minorities. One thing I also was hoping we could express in our teach out is understanding that even Pride within the US is not a monolithic event or an example. Pride within the US as a celebration looks very differently in the major city of maybe New York City versus in our backyard in Ann Arbor, Michigan. While celebration is at the heart of it, there are certainly, I would say, nuances that are regional, that are geographic, and maybe even cultural, depending on where those Pride celebrations take place. So even within the U.S., I think I want participants to understand that there are differences and nuances there as well as to what degree in which Pride is celebrated. And to kind of connect that to what you're expressing around rights, within the U.S., for example, we don't have federal protections around sexuality, gender identity, and gender expression. And some states do. So it makes me wonder, and I'm curious about how Pride celebrations in states that have very clear protections for gender and sexual minorities might even then differ from others within states that don't have those protections.
Right. And to think also of the cross-pollination of countries, right? I think that Europe allows a lot of traveling between countries and a lot of work permits and whatnot. And I think that, right, like this also allows for a cross-pollination of queer and trans folks and communities to be built in spaces where they feel like, they can exist and they can be celebrated, despite the laws and policies of that country as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So, we have another question from William Schmidt. So William asked a little bit about, what are the other identities that we encounter in the LGBTQ communities? Oftentimes we think of identities as how people are perceived and people are labeled, right, for the lack of a better term, but also of sub-communities, right? So sometimes there's labels for sub-communities as well of how people do identify as a group. So this is something that, William mentioned about the teach out not including is a list or even just kind of a more exponential, right, like verbiage of different communities and identities. So I just was wondering what your thoughts were about that, if we have any resources we can add to the teach out as well afterward.
Yeah, so I think it can be really challenging when approaching the topic that relates to a large community like the LGBTQ community to capture as many voices and as many identities as possible. I think you and I tried our best in making sure that the voices and narratives of those involved in the Teach Out expressed a wide variety of backgrounds, identities, experiences within the LGBTQ community. And we still probably missed identities that weren't spoken or expressed about. And that is always going to be the tension and challenge of wanting to represent the community as a whole, and then recognizing how there are so many distinctions, so many nuances, so many differences of those within the community. We also, within the Teach Out, we're limited by speaking with and including voices from the United States, from Southeast Michigan, and recognizing that there are so many other stories to share. One advice that I can give to participants in terms of where to learn about more information is actually through Coursera. Part of the Pride Teach Out was released in conjunction with other LGBTQ content specific courses across the world, actually. And so there are a couple courses out there that are specifically talking about and speaking to terminology and identities within the LGBTQ community. And it's definitely something I encourage participants to check out.
That sounds really great. I think, I've checked them out myself, and it looks like a very substantial amount of information and knowledge that I can't wait to discover even more. We kind of want to know, right, about the other identities and about how others identify. And what I want to highlight for at least LGBTQ communities is that typically we want people to self-identify and not to label somebody, right? We want them to be able to describe how they identify and how they feel. And if appropriate to use any verbiage or description, what would that be for that person versus us imposing that on the person as well. So,
Yeah, there's that difference between reading up and Googling different aspects or identities within the community versus meeting those who are within community and understanding how and trying to give them space to identify the way that they feel most comfortable. The next question comes from Ruben. Ruben is wondering, what can we do to normalize LGBTQ diversity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a big question, right? I think that that depends on different environments, different societies, and different cultures. I think what I want to start up with, though, is that, right, no matter what those contexts look like, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression are not something that, right, that's not a choice, right? People born or, live into it, right? They discover that throughout themselves, right? It's not something that, right, we ascribe to people. It's not something that, that people grow out because of the environment that they're in. They might influence it, but that doesn't really necessarily change how they identify, right? In terms of normalizing, right, like queer and trans communities, I think that it's really about starting with empathy, for me at least, of being able to relate to people, although we might not be able to understand how they experience life. But we're able to sympathize and empathize more especially with them, right? Education is a big tool, and that's why we're doing this Teach Out, is to be able to educate people about the different components of the LGBT community. I think that there's so much more out there. I think that because of the internet nowadays, right, there's so much more knowledge living out there, and that we need to be also careful of, right, what we know are not reliable sources as well, to be able to learn more about the LGBT community and normalize them as well. I think if we look at more of a macro level picture, systemically, this is going to be a little harder, I would say, than if we want to make change ourselves as an individual. So with people in power, whether they're allies or within the community, trying to shift the narrative to be able to bring a more inclusive system for LGBT communities might be able to help, right, the LGBT inclusion normalization as well of that community.
I definitely think on the individual level, empathy and education are key. And for me, part of empathy is uncovering your biases and having an understanding and reflecting on the ways in which you may hold stereotypes, biases, or hurtful ideas about who LGBTQ individuals are. And I think taking some time to not only expose yourself and educate yourself to those stories, which are available online, which are available through this Teach Out, which are available through other mediums, but also reflecting on, think about what does my relationship look like with LGBTQ individuals and communities? What are some of the biases that I may hold that get in the way of supporting and advocating for those who identify within the community? And uncovering and checking and working through those biases, I think, is really key as well.
I just want to maybe add another topic to that. We know that not everybody has access to, let's say, internet, or doesn't have all the resources to be able to educate themselves, right? And I was talking about that with some colleagues the other day, and I think that for me, what really helped me understand other people from other identities and experiences was really being exposed to them and learning more about what they're going through. So if folks in the LGBT community or with different identities than yours, really embracing that and relating to them and learning from their experiences, because I think this is the most authentic way of doing it, is to learn throughout lived experiences as well.
And I think the Teach Out is a good way to do that. I think that's what we were trying to model through the Teach Out, was exposing people across the world to these stories.
So one of the participants, Randy, asked a really good question about the intersection of interfaith and LGBTQ identities. Randy asked more specifically what we would like to see for interfaith clergies to be able to be more inclusive to LGBTQ folks and communities in order to live out the legacy of the Stonewall riots and Stonewall grassroots movement as well.
I think that's a really good question. And within that question, for me, brings up the idea and notion that we do need those who identify along different faith lines to show up and to show signs of support for LGBTQ individuals and communities. And it actually really heartens, it's very heartening for me when I'm at a Pride celebration to see different faith communities and congregations present within Pride, within the march, to show that they are supportive of who we are. Particularly because there is a very complicated and hard and hurtful history that a lot of religious communities and religious institutions have in terms of policing, excluding, discriminating against those who are LGBTQ, and trying to assign different moral standards to LGBTQ individuals that they may not apply to themselves. And so knowing that history is one of the key pieces that I think is important for interfaith clergy to know the history of your congregation, of your denomination, of your religion, and know what are the ways in which through that history have they excluded and discriminated against LGBTQ individuals. And I think it's important for clergy to even name that and name those histories, because showing up in support of LGBTQ individuals during Pride is important, but then how are you educating the rest of your faith community about those harmful histories, and what are the ways in which you're creating more inclusive space within your faith practices, within your faith communities, within your faith spaces that are inclusive and affirming, especially affirming of LGBTQ individuals and communities. So knowing the history of your religion and knowing what its experience against LGBTQ individuals are is really key. The other thing that comes to mind is what I really appreciate from those who seek to be allies for the LGBTQ community is that they have a lot of energy and a lot of spirit and a lot of motivation to be out there and to show up. And showing up is really important, but also thinking about through you showing up, how are the ways in which maybe you're taking away voice or taking away space from LGBTQ individuals? And how do you show support that may not be as visible? So it's one thing to come to a march, but then if someone in your congregation comes to you in a private conversation and expresses really harmful views about LGBTQ people, how are you addressing that within conversation? Are you actually addressing that in conversation? Or are you just pointing to the sign on your church that says we're affirming? Thinking about how Pride and showing up in Pride is one way to advocate and be inclusive and be an ally for the LGBTQ community. But there's so many other layers. I think interfaith clergy have a lot of power and within their spheres of influence, not only with those in their faith community, but also with their families. Within their institutions, they have a lot of power to shift hearts and minds, and that should be the work. And I think that's part of really honoring the legacy of the Stonewall riots.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I really appreciate how you highlighted the nuances of different faiths and religions as well. I think that, right, like what it looks like for an LGBTQ Muslim might be very different from what it looks like for an LGBTQ, let's say, Catholic, right? I think that those populations oftentimes comes with intersections of identities, sometimes with race, sometimes with ethnicity, historical perspectives as well. So I think, this is really good to know that when we're trying to address interfaith clergies, there are nuances to that as well. I also appreciate how you mentioned space is important, right? I think that showing up out there for the LGBT community is really good, but also sometimes creating space for them to be able to voice their concerns and challenges out is really important as well. So something that, we don't always have because sometimes we think that's not a need when it might definitely be a need, based on congregations and whatnot. So I appreciate those highlights that you brought up.
The next question we have is about intergenerational learning and acceptance. So how do you think we can reach out to all generations so they will accept each other?
Yeah, this is another big question. I think that, oftentimes when we think of LGBTQ communities on an intergenerational level, they all experience bias and challenges and successes in different ways, right? So back then, we didn't really have the internet when the Stonewall Ride started, but now we're seeing, at least in the U.S., in the high school level or middle school level, that people are coming out earlier, right? Because they are having those possibility models and those role models of people being seen in media, right? So I think for starters, is really to be able to address those gaps in exposure and learning and knowledge, even of like what it means to be able to be and to see LGBTQ people as well in the media. One thing that I can think of too is really exposing them to each other. I think that Pride celebrations, at least in the U.S., does a great job at bringing people together, no matter what their ages are. But I think that throughout the year we're able to do that as well. So at the Spectrum Center, for example, we have what we call a Friendly Call program with Sage Detroit, which is a nonprofit catering for LGBTQ elders. And we do have a volunteer program to be able to connect university students and LGBTQ elders more often, right? So I think that visiting retirement homes could be another one of them, and just bringing more, I would say, active and intentional interactions between generations could be really helpful. I think that it is potentially a concern about conflict in terms of how people experience the world, in terms of oppression, but also in terms of resilience as well. But how we're going to know that if we do not start conversations between generations, right? So I think that's a good place to start, to just even start, physical interactions, connections between generations. So Roman, one of our participants, Jacob, asked about, what are the pressing issues that we see nowadays for LGBT communities to be able to address? Jacob mentioned also, in the next 50 years, which can be some challenging notions in terms of respond. But what do you think are the pressing issues?
I think the fight for equal rights is certainly one of the most pressing issues, particularly in the United States. It is very visible right now. As you mentioned earlier, there were testimonies earlier this week by individuals within the community in front of the Supreme Court advocating for the Equality Act, advocating for federal protections that protect their sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And so I think equal rights and the movement towards equal rights is a very pressing issue for LGBTQ communities across the world in many different countries. While you may have regional protections, or at least in the case of the US, you have city protections, it doesn't do enough. So how do we advocate and move towards equal protections across different countries, across different states and nation states, I think is really key. Within that, the other thing that comes to mind is ensuring that our work is multi-issue. So there can be a tendency for the LGBTQ community to approach equal rights through a very single issue lens, that it's only about gender and it's only about sexuality. But one aspect of the teach out I was hoping we were able to emphasize is that the LGBTQ community comprises a lot of different identities, backgrounds, experiences. So how can the movement towards equal rights still represent the interests, the voices, the representation of those who don't necessarily have access to employment or economic stability, those who don't have access to education, those who don't have access to homes, etc. There are so many individuals within the community who don't necessarily have the privilege or access to be recognized as full citizens of the country. And I think that movements towards equal rights needs to take into all different accounts of identity and be multi-issued in their approach, else we're going to keep perpetuating this idea or keep perpetuating this this gap that we're only benefiting some within the community versus all.
Right. I really appreciate that you emphasize about the protection and not just rights, because as we alluded earlier to Uganda and Brazil, some people are being their lives are being taken away from them just for existing, right? Just for being themselves. And I think that when we think of policies and people who have power over intercontinental, intercountry policies, they can help, right, in order to be able to advance the movement and protection for LGBTQ people.
I also want to add that I think culture change is a huge pressing issue for LGBTQ communities, culture change across many different countries, and how rights and getting equal rights and protections are a part of culture change. But there are so many ways in which we need to be changing the hearts and minds of others to be more accepting of gender and sexual minorities, whether that is through education, whether that is through creating more inclusive spaces, or changing spaces that are initially exclusive to be more inclusive. I think there's so much more work to be done around culture change, and that's going to have nuances and distinctions and differences depending on where you are geographically, depending on what country you're within. Culture change is not an easy process, and it isn't a process that could take 50 years or even longer. And one aspect that I'm seeing and what really alarms me around culture change is that there's always going to be pushback. And it seems like while there is a movement largely to be more accepting of LGBTQ identities and communities, we're also seeing a pushback. We're also seeing very visceral, very visible, very harmful pushback by other countries, by other leaders of countries who are either reinstating the lack of protections or reinstating homosexual criminalization laws, for example. So that pushback is real, and I think part of the work of culture changes pushing through, if that makes any sense, is kind of like fighting through the pushback and recognizing that if I guess I'm of the mind, or I try to believe that pushback means that acceptance is on the horizon. Pushback to me means that there is a sign that we are moving in the right direction. Because if we weren't moving in the right direction, if there wasn't movement towards LGBTQ acceptance, then we wouldn't necessarily have people who are more visibly expressing disgust or hatred towards the community. So I think pushback is part of the cultural change process, and we need to keep fighting to change hearts and minds.
So Jacob mentioned pressing issues, and I think I agree with you, right? So they all vary. They might vary over time. They might vary over cultures, over countries and societies. I do want to highlight, and I think it would be inhumane for me not to mention it, that in the U.S. right now, for me at least, what a pressing issue is the murder of trans women of color, right? And more specifically Latinx and Black trans women. We've had about over 20 plus in 2019, and I think for me that's an epidemic, right? That we need to be able to tackle, to be more to bring more light to it, because I think that the media has their own priorities. But I think that's something that I do want to highlight, that if you are an ally to trans women and trans women of colors or to the trans population, do something about it on an individual level or systemic level. But something needs to be done about that. So when Jacob asked us about the pressing issues, I think that pressing issues are very individual lensed, right? So I think sometimes, right, what might be a pressing issue for you might be different for me. And I think it's important to recognize. And if folks are allies and they're wanting to know more about pressing issues within the community, is really to connect with LGBTQ communities and folks and learn more about like what are the challenges that you're going through right now and how can I support you. And I think that true allyship looks something like this as well. So Roman, thank you so much for taking the time to, answer the questions with me of our participants. I also want to thank our participants for the questions, really critical questions that you've asked us. And thank you for participating in the Tea Chat as well. It was a pleasure to be part of this learning moments with you.